And the privilege of giving a talk at your own institution is that I was teaching between 1 and 2, so hopefully I still have some energy and to provoke you with all of my energy. And hopefully I'm going to offend every one of you here. Before I start, I would like to say a little bit about myself because I think it's going to be relevant to what's going to follow next. So I am both a philosopher of physics and a social epistemologist, and my method in both of these fields is fairly formal. So I prove theorems in philosophy of physics, and I build computational models for social epistemology and social structures of science. And moreover, although it is not explicit in my social epistemology work, an implicit methodology that I use is autoethnography. So what this means is that I exist, I go to spaces, I think about the kind of choices and behaviors that I do, and I look at other people's choices and decisions and think about what are the relevant social, environmental factors that might have played a role in us and them thinking the ways that we do and pursuing the kind of research that we end up pursuing. So this overall project is very much inspired by me going to conferences, talking to colleagues, and sometimes gossiping with others. So the target phenomena that I'm going to talk about is the following. So marginalized academics often feel the pressure to conform to a higher standard of rigor in their work. And this consumes many aspects of our academic life, from presenting our work to others. This is getting very meta here. But also a point. This talk, I've managed to not use a single mathematical symbol in this talk. I think the first kind of talk that I give in this kind of way. To choosing our research, to executing our research and to choosing our research agenda, and sometimes also in our pedagogical decisions. And I call this phenomena rigor capture. So for those of you who have experience navigating such constraints, this is probably palpably recognizable to you. So we feel the need to work extra hard to make our work airtight and sometimes bulletproof, since we worry that any gap in our argument may be used against us. But on the other hand, there's also a special kind of psychological comfort when we do rigorous work. So the work can be difficult, but if it pans out, one will be able to present it in a way such that relevant experts can reliably assign appropriate credit to the author. So for instance, if we prove a theorem, then it would be difficult for others to deny us the credit associated with it. But however, if we work on the topic for which the credit assignment varies widely according to who the audience is, or worse, according to the potential biases of the audience, then this option seems very much risky. So I am interested in understanding this phenomena further, including what it is, why and when it happens, and how it impacts the individuals under capture and also the academic community as a whole. So to give you an idea of the kind of cases that I'm thinking about, so here are some stylized examples of what rigor capture looks like in research communication. So this is when, after a substantial part of the work is done, marginalized scholars might feel the pressure to demonstrate higher levels of rigor when communicating their work to others. So imagine the case of Philippa, who is a young woman in logic who's giving a paper at a premier conference in her field. So during her presentation, she makes sure to talk through individual steps of her proofs as much as possible. compare this with the case of Felix, who is a young man on a precarious contract in logic, who's also given, imagine the same paper at the same premier conference. So during his presentation, he does exactly the same thing. He makes sure to talk through individual steps as much as possible. And contrast this with the case of Philip here, who is a young man from a comfortable material condition in logic, who's giving the same paper at a premier conference in his field. And during his presentation, he highlights the salient moves of his proofs, which gives him space to discuss the conceptual upshot of his results during the same talk. So the three cases here lead to a puzzle of the following sort. So suppose that if audience members react positively to all of their respective presentations, then the credit that Philip will accrue will be higher than what Philippa or Felix will accrue, right? So after all, Philip has both presented impressive results and also discussed their conceptual upshots, whereas Philippa and Felix have only presented the results in a very thorough way. So given this, why didn't Philippa or Felix just behave like Philip? Well, there are probably many reasons for this, but in this talk, I'm going to discuss two possible explanations for this result. So the punchline is that Philippa and Felix both cannot afford to act like Philip, but I think for different reasons. So first, for scholars like Philippa, she may face what I call identity-based distrust in her discipline as compared to her peers. So her work would not be trusted unless she presents her work rigorously. But for scholars like Felix, he might face a poorer fallback option in case his work does not gain the requisite uptake. So he chooses to present his work rigorously to avoid the very, very poor consequences. So understanding those two different mechanisms, I think, is important because it helps us understand a second related puzzle. So some of you might say to me that, hold on, Jingyi, you might be getting this backwards because women are underrepresented in the so-called rigorous fields. So while women and people from lower socioeconomic status are both underrepresented in academia, women are even more underrepresented in rigorous fields, but not people from lower socioeconomic background. So just to give you some empirical data for this evidence. So according to the latest Equality in Higher Education report published by Advanced HE UK, while very close to 50% of all academic staffs in the UK are not women, they're much more severely underrepresented in subjects like electrical engineering, physics, mathematics, economics, and also philosophy, with all of the representation less than a third of the overall staff population. And on the other hand, this is a very good, very recent study by Abraminski and co-authors. So they analyzed over 100,000 US academics who were active between 1900s and 1969. So it's a sample of 87% men. And they linked their family background through US Census data. And they find the following. So they find that while 5% of all academics come from the bottom 20% of the family income bracket, they're much more represented in rigorous fields such as physics and mathematics. So you might ask why. So while I'm not going to explicitly solve this puzzle in this talk here, I think one way to make sense of this data is by thinking about the different mechanisms that drive scholars into rigorous work. So for scholars who face identity-based distrust, the overall expected benefit for them to stay in or entering rigorous fields can be lower than those who face poor fallback options, precisely because of the differential uptake when they do not meet the stringent standard. But for those with very poor fallback options, the overall expected benefit for them to leave rigorous fields can be lower than those who face identity-based distrust, precisely because of the poor fallback option that they face. So in other words, for people who are like Philippa, the pressure for them to meet a higher standard of rigor might deter them from entering a field. But for people like Felix, who face poor fallback options, the pressure to meet a higher standard of rigor actually incentivizes them to stay in the field. And of course, many of us are marginalized in both of those ways, or even more ways like that. And for them, they may face both the push and pull motion acting on them simultaneously. Okay, so here is the plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to first explicate the target phenomena a little bit more by articulating 3 more interrelated forms of rigor capture, and also present some empirical evidence for them. And after that, I'll briefly discuss the positive functions of rigor, as well as some of its cost. And after that, I will discuss the 2 possible mechanisms that drive agents towards rigor. First, as a response to identity-based distrust, and second, as a response to material precarity. And finally, I will discuss how rigor capture impacts the individual under capture and also the community as a whole. Okay. So earlier, we saw examples of rigor capture during the research communication phase. But what happens when we discuss our research is impacted by and also impacts the processes further upstream, including how we do our research and what research we do. And on the other hand, rigor capture can also manifest in areas where we're not evaluated by our peers, but also rather by our students. So this is the case of rigor capture in teaching. So I'll discuss each of these cases briefly, and then provide some empirical evidence suggesting that they might exist, on top of the anecdotal evidence that I've collected myself talking to others. So moreover, later during the talk, I'll only discuss the possible mechanisms that lead to rigor capture in research communication, but I hope that it is clear how that will permeate into other aspects of our academic life. Okay, so rigor capture in research execution is the situation where marginalized scholars might face pressure to meet a higher standard of rigor during the research process itself. So in order to present rigorously, we need to previously do work in a rigorous manner. So here's an example for it. So suppose that there is a female psychologist who's running a study, and she uses a larger sample than her peer, uses very careful pre-registration, and also writes very detailed documentation for each step in her supplementary materials. So although it is difficult to operationalize rigor, I think there are several empirical studies that together show that marginalized people perceive that they're held to higher standards and also that they work harder to achieve those standards. Before I present the evidence here, also another caveat, the evidence that I can find are mostly along gender lines, and I think we simply just need more research along other social dimensions. So first, evidence for higher perceived or actual standard. So Miradil did a mixed method study on law professors who's along gender and also racial lines, but here is evidence along gender lines. So she reports that female law professors describe experiencing narrow margins of error in their professional activities. And there's another piece of anecdotal evidence in philosophy physics, but it's in print right now. So this comes from Laura Ritchie, who is a senior woman in philosophy of physics at the University of Michigan. So in 2020, she wrote a paper titled, "What's It Like to Be a Woman in Philosophy of Physics?" It included some vignettes. One of the vignettes is, in 1994, I submit a paper, my first ever, to Foundations of Physics Letters. Standard practice is to send the paper to 2 referees, and mine is sent to 6. So this is anecdotal reports to actual stringent standard. Economists have also recently been studying this phenomena. So here's a quite popular, famous paper by Erin Hengel, who finds that female author papers in top economics journals demonstrate higher readability scores than equivalent male author papers. So although readability is not rigor per se, it provides one precise way in which female academics perceive the standard to be higher for them. And moreover, this gap widens during peer review, so it also provides some evidence that there's actual higher standard that's being imposed to female authors during peer review. And also in economics, there is a recent very nice paper showing that female economists are less confident when being asked questions outside of their field of expertise. So philosopher Catherine Hawley proposes that one way to understand this particular piece of data is that women have a higher threshold for when they feel competent enough to speak. And now going to research execution, there is widespread evidence of what is the so-called over-efforting for women in STEM fields. So that is working a lot more than their male peers. So here is a particular piece of kind of depressing personal anecdote about over-efforting. So one study subject said, "Here I reworked my papers over and over until I couldn't find anything more to fix before sending them off. 2 of my papers were accepted with no changes requested. What did I do? I called and told them that I had some changes to make." What a waste, she said. In the same time and with the same energy, I could have written 3 papers, not 1. So further upstream in the research process, the pressure to demonstrate rigor extends beyond how to execute and communicate our research, but also in what work gets pursued in the first place. So in order to execute and present rigorous work, we need to choose a rigorifiable topic. Right? So this is a situation where marginalized academics find themselves steering towards projects that align with established standards of rigor and away from exploratory, creative, or conceptual work. So here's an example that's closer to us. It's from Jennifer Morton, who is a philosopher at University of Pennsylvania. And she describes her own trajectory in philosophy as an undergrad at Princeton. And she said, as I started taking more philosophy courses, I realized that the tacit culture of the department was that the smart students shied away from ethics or political philosophy and went in for the heavy stuff. I'm sorry, I was equally triggered when I read philosophy of language, mind, and metaphysics. As a curious undergrad, I was interested in all of it. But I could tell that if I was going to show that I could do the hard work, I needed to cultivate my interest in some fields and not others. And as a first-generation woman of color, and also as a migrant, she said I was particularly keen to gain respect and standing within this world by showing that I was capable of doing the most, quote-unquote, difficult, rigorous, and abstract work. So rigor capture in this form is an instance of value capture as described by T. Wynn, right? So in Jennifer Morton's case, she begins with a rich range of intellectual values that might be reflected in all sorts of topics that she's interested in. But she felt that her social and material environment creates conditions where the value of rigor comes to dominate her practical reasoning. And as a very nice piece of empirical support for this, there's a recent study that showed that in grant applications, women use significantly narrower and topic-specific language when men deploy broader framing in grant application. So this is in the US studying the Gates Foundation and NIH grant applications. They are punished for it. Reviewers scored women's proposals lower. However, female grant recipients generated more subsequent grants. So what this means is that women's more cautious and specific language may actually reflect higher research quality, even if it disadvantages them in evaluation. So this also supports rigor capture in the research execution phase. So the three kinds of rigor capture that I have just surveyed cascade, right? So if one thinks that they must present rigorously, then they're more likely to produce rigorous research. And if they think that they need to produce rigorous research, then they must choose a research topic that is rigorifiable. I'm going to invent this word. And after seeing a few of those projects go through, they then gain the practice and confidence needed to keep producing this rigorous work. And they might be typeset by the community as someone who just does this kind of work, which would makes it even more difficult for them to escape from this cascade. And it might make them even more psychologically daunting. And on the other hand, if one thinks that it is okay for them to present with selective rigor, then they might feel okay about not filling out every step in their argument and might eventually warm them up to choosing a project that's more broad or exploratory. Finally, there is rigor capture in teaching. I said I'm just gonna offend everyone. So this is a case where the evaluators are not our peers, but our students. So it's a situation where instructors from marginalized background may feel the need to teach more rigorous content in order to gain respect from students, even if the material that they teach from may be too difficult for the students. So from anecdotal evidence, so a lot of marginalized academics feel this way, but here are some stylized examples. So for instance, when teaching class on space and time, a Black assistant professor decided to give students a primer on the basics of differential geometry and topology before talking about any of the philosophical upshoots. That's very stylized because there are like basically no Black.
It's vacuously true.
Second example, a female professor prefers to teach a course on a narrow but specific topic rather than intro survey courses. Okay, so we've seen various kinds of rigor capture. In order to understand why that happens, we need to think a little bit more about what rigor does and what makes it attractive. So rigor, derived from Latin meaning stiffness, is often associated with strict and careful adherence to a gold standard in a context. Unfortunately, to me, what this gold standard involves or should involve in a particular context is often contentious. And it is contentious particularly for political reasons, because people all want to say that what they do is rigorous. But fortunately, what rigor is supposed to do is less contentious. So a rigorous piece of work is supposed to convince its audience of its results based on the content of the work itself. And often one achieves rigor by strictly following a community-sanctioned procedure with a formal set of properties. So in the recent book by Cartwright and co-authors, they listed some of the formal set of properties that's typically present in rigorous work. And that involves non-triviality, which means that it requires some effort and thought in it. It's auditable, which means that it has steps that can be checked by the audience members. It also follows precise rules, including a valid argument, so that if the inputs of the procedure is correct, then the output must follow. So it is not a surprise that quantitative and mathematical methods are often satisfy these properties, and this is perhaps why we often think of quantitative and mathematical fields as rigorous in this sense. So for instance, recall Philippa and Philip's meticulous proofs at the beginning. They follow every step they follow every step in the community-sanctioned procedure of a formal proof. So rigor, as conceived in this way, has the following two functions that might be quite useful for some of us. First is what I call author-invariant credibility. So what this means is that the credibility of the work lies in the work itself, regardless of who performs it. So if the procedures are executed according to the recognized standards, then the procedural adherence itself lends credibility to the work. And second is what I call evaluator invariant credit assignment. So the mechanical application of the recognized procedures often means that the evaluators do not need to exercise individual judgment about the validity of the work. So if the procedures appear to be properly followed, then the results typically merit acceptance. So what it does effectively is that rigor eliminates individual judgments, both on the part of the author of the work and also on the part of the evaluator. So one thing I will add is that different evaluators here might still disagree about the conceptual significance of the result, but they will at least assign appropriate credit to executing the process well. So rigorous work provides a few benefits, but it also comes at a cost. So first and foremost, there's only so much that we can establish rigorously. So there are two senses of this narrowness here. So first, because we need to apply a process rigorously, what we end up establishing in a given project is very limited. And second, there might be interesting problems that we currently do not have rigorous solutions for. And sometimes in order to make progress, we need to make use of other reliable but decidedly not rigorous methods. And so second, there are practical benefits of non-rigorous methods. So we are often restricted by the time and space of the work itself, so we might not be able to include everything, even if we want to. And second, there are also epistemic benefits. So for instance, selective departure from fully rigorous work can highlight some salient conceptual innovations in the work itself. The ingenious steps, so to speak, as Richard Pettigrew calls it, by omitting steps that are often routine. So another way to see this point is to think about how mathematical proofs are often taught in school. So if we're teaching total novices, then we might have a higher standard of rigor for them, and we want them to write out every step of the proof. But as they advance and become more and more familiar and competent in the basics, we progressively might tolerate less detailed proofs to highlight conceptually salient moves. And finally, we might depart from full rigor in order to prioritize other intellectual virtues, such as conceptual breadth, creativity, communicative ease, etc. So now, as alluring as falling short of rigor may appear to you, not everyone can afford to do it. And in what follows, I'll discuss the two mechanisms that I think possibly drive marginalized academics towards rigor. And the first mechanism that I'm going to talk about has to do with the interplay between trust and rigor. So the idea here is that in cases that the work itself is not fully rigorous to warrant acceptance, trust bridges the gap here. So if the speaker is perceived to be trustworthy, then the audience may readily accept their judgment. However, if they're not typically perceived to be trustworthy, then they might need something else to establish the credibility. So there's a parallel argument of this nature in the history of social sciences. Theodore Porter, in his very seminal book called Trusting Numbers, traces the rise of mathematical and quantitative methods in the social sciences and bureaucracy to a demand for trust from the public. So he shows that in weaker disciplines where there is very little credibility of its own, the mechanical objectivity of these methods functions as an alternative to trust. So similarly, for marginalized scholars who are perceived to be less trustworthy, the impersonal nature of rigorous work lends credibility for them. In other words, they're captured by the author invariant credibility associated with rigor. So marginalized scholars might likely develop this strategy through years of themselves and others interacting with audience members. So they might have gotten very pointed questions about, what about that step in slide 7? Please explain that to me. But they might not even have to experience this themselves. Audience members' dismissal to another person who they identify with can already serve as opportunities for them to develop this kind of learning. And this is how I think differences in subjective standards of rigor can evolve. And let me demonstrate this with a possible prehistory of the story of Philip and Philippa. So here, suppose that at a previous conference, Philip gives a talk at a logic that is high in its creativity and conceptual breadth, but average in its mathematical rigor. During the Q&A, audience members praise Philip for the highly ambitious work and nobody asked any questions about how the mathematics will work out, assuming either that the math would follow or that he has already done the work. And contrast this with Philippa, also at the conference, gave the same talk, but during the Q&A, several audience members questioned Philippa whether she has sufficient mathematical evidence to back up her speculative claim. So the next time Philippa encounters similar enough situation, she might choose to play up her technical competence in order to preempt doubt. So if she knows that she can spend some time to actually sketch out the entire proof, she would choose to do that. Because that way she will not face the negative consequences that she has experienced in the past. And eventually, she might become the Philippa that we see at the beginning of this talk, who makes sure to talk through every single step of her proof as much as possible. So how does this identity-based distrust arise? There are several theoretical reasons of how this comes about. So the first is through stereotypes about field-specific competence levels. So for instance, women and people from some marginalized racial or ethnic identities, for instance, being Black, Latinx, also people from some Asian backgrounds, but not others, are often stereotyped to be less competent in mathematical and formal skills. So when someone who is negatively stereotyped does not display those skills, then audience members might interpret this lack of evidence as evidence of lack of competence. And this can also be explained through what's called the double standards theory in psychology, according to which the standards that individuals use to determine if a given performance is indicative of ability is a function of what's called the diffuse status characteristic that's salient in a setting. So when people who possess the lower state of this characteristic, for instance, being a woman in mathematics, when they perform well on the task, then their performance are critically scrutinized because a good performance is inconsistent with the status-based expectation for them. But when people with a higher status in that characteristic performs equally well, then their performances are consistent with their expectation and are therefore less scrutinized. So this theory has a lot of support in empirical and lab settings, and this also connects up to Ella's work on how marginalized people may be strikingly salient in a context, and therefore might get scrutinized more. And second, there's also experimental evidence showing that by merely becoming aware that there are multiple groups present in a community, this can already lead to intergroup distrust. And in this case, the group that is in the numerical minority, on average, will get distrusted more because they face evaluators from the opposite group more often. And this is so even without negative stereotyping. And just as an aside, I don't think I have time to go into it. I think the identity-based distrust here is conceptually related but different from testimonial injustice that Miranda Fricker talks about. And you can ask me about it during Q&A if you want. I can talk about it. So what this means is that scholars who have a social identity that is negatively associated with competence in the field, or who are in a numerical minority group that becomes salient to the audience member, experience identity-based distrust more. So this can be people like women in STEM fields or philosophy. And the second mechanism that I'm going to talk about briefly has to do with differential consequences of failure. So for scholars who face very poor outcomes if their current project does not receive uptake, it can be rational for them to choose a more certain option, even when they do not face identity-based distrust themselves. So in other words, they are captured by the evaluator invariant credit assignment associated with Rigor. So to go back to the case from the beginning, Felix, for instance, may not have the opportunity to try again if he fails. So here, scholars from lower socioeconomic background, migrant scholars who might be on precarious visa status, scholars on precarious contract, for instance, may experience material precarity more, and as a result, they're subjected to rigor capture. So I've now discussed two mechanisms for rigor capture. And before discussing its consequences, I'll briefly talk a little bit about how the two mechanisms might interact for agents who are intersectional. And this might lead to different incentive structures for them. So first, for scholars who experience both identity-based distrust and material precarity, they might experience rigor capture even more. And moreover, as scholars advance through the system and become more and more materially secure, getting a permanent job, getting salary, for instance, they may be able to escape the capture. And this may eventually be the case for scholars who experience identity-based distrust too, but the threshold of material security that they need to feel comfortable to escape would be higher for them. And on the other hand, there is another kind of marginalized scholar who is just not subjected to rigor capture at all. And this is the kind of scholar who's so underprivileged that no matter what they do, they always face scrutiny. So my example for this is Evelyn Fox Keller, who is a pioneer in feminist theoretical biology and philosophy, and also a philosopher of biology, who has won prestigious awards for her work in that field. But in the 1950s and 1960s, she did a PhD in physics at Harvard and endured horrendous treatment while she was there that she recounted in this paper, The Anomaly of Women in Physics. So she said, it's too striking, I have to read. I had in fact been warned about the extreme alienation of the first year as a graduate student at Harvard, but both my vanity and naivety permitted me to ignore these warnings. I was confident, she said, that things would be different for me. That confidence did not last long. Coming from everywhere, from students and faculty alike, were three messages. First, physics at Harvard was the most difficult enterprise in the world. Second, I could not possibly understand the things I thought I understood. And third, my lack of fear was proof of my ignorance. And she continued, when I turned in particularly good work, it was suspected, indeed sometimes assumed, that I had plagiarized it. On one such occasion, I had written a paper, the thesis of which had provoked much argument and contention in the department. In an effort to resolve the paradox created by my results, I went to see the professor for whom I had written the paper. And after an interesting discussion, I was asked, innocently and kindly, from whose articles I had copied my argument. She left physics and went into theoretical biology after this. So just to connect this phenomena to related literature in political philosophy, rigor capture here is an instance of what's called respectability politics, which is a political strategy wherein members of a marginalized community consciously conform to prescribed mainstream standards in order to assimilate. So for instance, in the face of injustice, do not be angry, but rather be civil so that you get respected and have a seat at the table. And to put crudely, we need to prove our worth first. And this strategy, although reasonable as a survival mechanism, as I have argued, and when doing well, can even uplift the community, it has undesirable consequences. So on the individual level, although it gives marginalized scholars security in how their work will be received, they achieve this at the cost of being undercredited as compared to their privileged peers. And I'll also show that they face a very precise triple bind in this situation. And on the community level, the community also misses out on the possible epistemic benefits of social diversity. So I'll discuss the two bolded consequences very briefly. So rigor capture, I think, leads to a triple bind situation for marginalized scholars in the following form. So if they present rigorous work, then audience members may think that they lack conceptual grasp on the topic. If they present conceptually clear work, then audience members may think that they don't have the technical chops needed for doing the work. On the other hand, if they manage to deliver work that is both technically rigorous and conceptually clear, then doing this work may take them longer, which will contribute to a gender and racial productivity gap that many of my colleagues here have worked on. So all of these options might seem undesirable, and choosing either the first rigorous route or the time-consuming route might be the best of all the three evils. So on the community level, I think it also leads to a suboptimal situation for the following reasons. So social diversity is argued, it is argued that social diversity can benefit group inquiry by having epistemic diversity as a mediating factor. So this is sometimes often called the business case for diversity. And this is because those with different backgrounds might tend to bring different beliefs, assumptions, and interests into the practice, which would lead to epistemically beneficial diversity. And on top of it, intergroup and one-sided distrust is shown theoretically to also be epistemically beneficial in certain conditions, precisely because of the benefit of diversity of practice. And I myself and also other colleagues in the field have built models to show this. But I think rigor capture can seriously dampen this potential for epistemic benefit from social diversity by preventing the emergence of epistemic diversity. Why? Because, well, existing rigorous methods in the scientific community do not come from nowhere. So they were likely developed around the beliefs, assumptions, and interests of existing members. But if the diverse newcomers who end up making it in the community are also the ones who are most captured by existing standards of rigor or are otherwise privileged in other ways, then there is a tragic mismatch between the potential for better knowledge that the diverse scholars are supposed or theorized to bring and what they are motivated to do in the situation. How much time do I have?
Well, I mean, it depends how much time we have for questions. So the sooner you finish, the more questions we'll get in. So things are pretty bad already, so if you don't want
Okay, things are pretty bad already, and I can talk about how it can get worse in the Q&A. Some hopeful notes. What do we do now? And here I briefly evaluate some options, and I'm curious what you all think. So you might ask, do we get rid of rigor? My short answer is not quite, right? Rigorous work are attractive to marginalized scholars precisely because the security it brings, since there is a standard. The second question I often get is, what about anonymization? Does it help? And I think it helps a little bit, but there are still like so much of our professional activities that is just not anonymous at all, such as giving talks, teaching in front of students, and hiring practices. So even if our papers go through anonymous peer review, we still need to, we're still associated with it. Third option, do we reward highly rigorous work? Well, I think this would help with the under-creditation situation, but it might not help for the community level harm due to the lack of epistemic diversity. Here are a few open suggestions. I think one thought is we can try to foster trust within the community. So Porter's book has a very nice discussion of, perhaps surprisingly, in frontier physics communities with very high level of trust and personal knowledge of other researchers, there's often a tolerance for less rigorous work because they value the highly intuitive contribution from the group members. And another option might be providing low stakes spaces for professional exchanges. So this is tackling the poor fallback option situation. So if we have spaces where scholars can go in and think that the consequence might be pretty low stakes, it might encourage them to do more creative work. But this is easier said than done, and we might need to foster trust altogether in order to encourage the low stakes spaces. Okay, so this is when I turn to you. What do you think? Do you have other anecdotes, real or imagined, of rigor capture? Are there other possible causes? Other potential consequences? And what do we do? Things a lot.